If you just join with me in a quick time of prayer. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Open our eyes to hear our ears to hear your voice. Open our eyes to see your will, and open our hearts to act accordingly. Amen. Well, you know that feeling when you revisit a movie that you haven't seen in a really long time, and as you're rewatching it, you realize things about it that you never did before. Maybe sometimes the jokes are cheesier or cringier than you remember. The graphics are grainier, or the special effects less believable than you remember. And you might even come across an adult reference that went over your head once before. There's that moment when you're rewatching one of your favorites from when you were younger, and you're telling yourself, "Oh, this is so bad." Like the acting, the plot holes, all of it is just like, man, how did I like this? But of course, the nostalgia is kicking in, so you're like, I'll keep watching anyway. Well, let me give you an example. There was a movie that came out in 1988 called Mac and Me. This is the movie poster. And I like the tagline on the poster: Eric's new in the neighborhood, Mac's new on the planet. Sidebar, that neighborhood that Eric moves into is California, and a good chunk of the story is set in a high desert just outside of Palmdale. So, just a fun fact. Anyway, one synopsis I read reads like this: Mac comes from the far reaches of space. A family of extraterrestrials finds themselves accidentally transported to Earth. Escaping from a government facility, the youngest of this alien brood is separated from the others. Now alone, afraid, and millions of miles from home, this mysterious alien creature, Mac, must rely on the kindness and friendship of a very special boy named Eric in order to survive this strange new world. With the help of Eric's family and friends, they'll undertake the journey of a lifetime to reunite Mac with his family. And for some reason, I really loved this movie as a kid, as ridiculous as it sounds. You know, what I didn't seem to notice back then was it's just a poorly made knockoff of E.T. Came out 4 years later than E.T. Even the name of the alien sounds like a knockoff. Mysterious alien creature, Mac. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it as E.T., extraterrestrial, right? Rotten Tomatoes, they gave it a 7%, not surprisingly. And here was their verdict: Mac and Me is duly infamous. Not only is it a pale imitation of E.T., it's also a thinly veiled, feature-length commercial for McDonald's and Coca-Cola. So, as bad as it is, and probably because it's so bad, this movie has gained somewhat of a cult following over the years. And if there's any Conan O'Brien fans here, you've seen this same clip from Mac and Me played over and over again on different episodes of Conan O'Brien. And it's one of my favorite gags of all time. Every time Paul Rudd's been a guest on the Conan O'Brien show, going all the way back to 2004 when Paul Rudd was on the TV show Friends, he tells Conan that he's brought a clip from his latest project, his latest movie, but every time when the clip rolls, it's the same 20-second clip from Mac and Me. And he even did this recently on an episode of Conan's podcast, so you're just hearing the audio portion of the clip, which I think is pretty great. But here is my point. I had to rewatch Mac and Me later on as an adult to understand that it is, in fact, a truly terrible movie. And I love it for different reasons now, but the point is that it's not what I thought it was until I circled back around with fresh eyes. And in a similar way, the story of Samson, with that story, it took fresh eyes and a little bit of life experiences and some studying to come to the conclusion that that story of Samson is not what I thought it was. It has far different meaning than what I originally got from it. And so here we are, taking a fresh look at the story of Samson in the third week of our current series entitled #Never Saw It Coming. And in this short 4-week series, we have been taking a closer look at some surprising stories in the book of Judges. And today we're looking at probably the most familiar story in the book of Judges, the story of Samson. Now, most of us know that about Samson's notorious strength and his long, flowing Fabio hair. But do we know the whole story, or better yet, its message? For me, Samson is not at all what it seemed at surface level. In fact, I think I would go as far to say that some of us should probably just toss out what we've heard about the story, what it means, why we should read it, etc., and just start over with a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And so the story begins on a very hopeful note. We meet Samson's parents, his father Manoah, his mother who is unnamed, which I'll be coming back to that, who are visited by an angel with an important message. Here's what that angel has to say. Judges 13, verses 3 through 5. Although you are barren, having borne no children, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink or to eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor is to come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazirite to God from birth. It is he who shall begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Now, even though the book of Judges can be a pretty heavy read, as we've already seen these last couple weeks, we do get some comic relief in this first chapter of the story, in chapter 13. Samson's mother, she is dialed in. She takes everything in stride as it's happening and responds immediately with a razor-sharp understanding. And then there's Manoah, her husband, Samson's father, future father, who just can't seem to make heads or tails of what's going on. Poor guy. Maybe he missed his cup of coffee that day because his brain is just not firing on all cylinders. Maybe he's still in shock that they're finally going to be having a baby. But whatever the case, here's the play-by-play. The angel first visits Samson's mother, just the mother, who tells her that she is going to be pregnant with her first child, Samson. She goes, finds her husband Manoah, tells him everything. So, mission accomplished, right? End scene. We're all good. Nope. Actually, our sweet little dum-dum Manoah isn't there yet. He's still not quite catching up. Apparently, everything his wife has been saying to him is just noises, kind of like the Charlie Brown teacher, wah, 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 wah. And you're wondering as a reader, like, where is this guy's head? What's he daydreaming about? So Manoah, he takes this opportunity to pray to God that God would send the angel once more to teach them what to do about this baby who's on the way. And Judges 13:8 says this, Manoah entreated the Lord and said, "Oh, my Lord, I pray, let the man of God whom you have sent come to us again and teach us what we should do concerning the boy who will be born." And amazingly, God humors him, and the angel returns exactly like before, visiting Manoah's wife, just Manoah's wife, once again, who then goes and runs to Manoah again. And as readers, we're like, haven't we already done this before? Manoah, of course, hearing this, runs with his wife back to the place where the angel approached her, and Manoah asks the angel what they're supposed to do as parents for this special child. Judges 13:12. Then Manoah said, "Now when your words come true, what is to be the boy's rule of life? What is he to do?" And the angel says, well, I'm paraphrasing, "Oh, this is what you brought me all the way back down here for? Okay, all right. You know all the things that your wife explained to you earlier? Yeah, just do those things and you'll be good." So, poof, the angel vanishes, and suddenly it dawns on our sweet little dum-dum Manoah that they have been talking to an angel. His wife, of course, knows this or has some sense of it, but Manoah's got some catch-up to do, and he starts freaking out, panicking that they're going to die because they've come face to face with God. And his wife just looks at him and says something like, "Honey, I can tell you're having a hard time with this. If we were going to die, we'd already be dead. I think God knows what he's doing, so just trust the process." And that's pretty much all we get from Samson's dad for the rest of that story, except for some minor involvement. But hey, he's trying. You got to give him that. He's trying. I'm a little worried about what parenting will look like if he's already having this much trouble. It makes me think of a Bored Panda article that I saw entitled 111 Reasons Why Kids Can't Be Left Alone with Their Dads. So basically a bunch of photos of dads trying very hard to parent, emphasis on the word trying. Here's a dad, doesn't really know how hair ties are supposed to work. That's obviously not a hair tie. A dad who's tying up the wrong thing. Here's a dad who doesn't understand how Sophie the giraffe is supposed to work, or bottle feeding for that matter. And then just a bunch of wrong ways to carry a baby, like here and here, also here and here. I mean, he's just screwing around at this point. This guy is like, I don't know, I kind of have a respect for this. He's dedicated to being a creative parent. And then, this guy, I think there's no scenario where this last one ends well. Dad towing his kids on a mattress behind his ATV. Pastor Jim, don't show Ezra this one. We don't want to give him any, ideas. I'm just kidding. We know that Ezra's going to be an amazing dad. Now, biblical scholars will tell you that there is a slow descent into chaos and destruction as the book of Judges goes along, sort of like an ATV pulling kids on a mattress, with each of Israel's judges getting worse and worse. So when we come to chapter 13 and experience this mystical encounter with an angel from heaven, learning about a divinely appointed birth that will bring an end to a woman's season of being childless and an end to Israel's subjugation, we're thinking to ourselves, hey, things are turning around. The future is looking bright. Maybe there is hope after all. God has set into motion the plans for a judge who, quoting verse 5, will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. And keep in mind that when we say judge, we're not talking about someone in a robe with a gavel. As Niddich writes, to judge is not to sit soberly at court. Judges make decisions based upon divine inspiration. They command respect as leaders because of the perception that the Spirit of God is within them, and their battle prowess sometimes places on them the outer borders of sanity. And as we'll see, that last part about the outer borders of sanity is definitely true of Samson. And yet we know that Samson is called by God to a very important job. And we know this by the lifestyle that he is instructed to live. The word Nazarite means one separated or one consecrated. And in Numbers chapter 6, we see Moses telling the people of Israel to observe these Nazarite rules for a brief period of time to get themselves right with God. But Samson's vows, these are not for a brief period of time. These are permanent. They're lifelong. So why? Why is Samson called to these lifelong Nazarite vows? Because Israel is in a complete state of crisis. It's so bad that they're in need of a judge who is completely, totally devoted to that role, and those Nazirite vows are meant to remind him of that every single day. Maybe an analogy would be something like a Navy SEAL who's been through the gauntlet in training. Samson doesn't just draw some random lottery ticket to be a lucky winner of extra rules that no one else has to follow. No, Samson is handpicked by God, a chosen person to lead the people. He's drafted for a very specific and very important reason. He's handpicked with a prophetic role, and his main role is to get Israel back in line with God and to deliver Israel from its oppressors, who in this case are the Philistines, who have ruled over Samson's people cruelly for 40 years. In recent sermons, Pastor Jim has shared this chart, which shows the unfortunate cycle that keeps perpetuating in the life of Israel, which God is trying to break. It starts with idolatry, a broad idea that includes all kinds of ways that the people forget their covenant with God. It leads to God allowing other nations to conquer them, and eventually they cry out, and every time God has compassion on them in their suffering and makes a plan to deliver them. And in our story today, Samson was supposed to be that judge that initiates that deliverance. The very first verse of our story clues us into the problem that Samson is supposed to help solve. Judges 13:1. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. Biblical scholar McCann writes this, Clinton McCann, the story of Samson is about what the entire book of Judges is about. God's will to oppose cruel oppression and the difficulties involved in the actual embodiment of God's will by God's people, especially in a Canaanite context. On this past Monday, I drove down to Long Beach for an event that USC's Center for Religion and Civic Culture presented to help pastors and other leaders find new ideas and new partnerships for thriving in ministry in the midst of the many shifts that are happening since this pandemic has begun. And they had two panels that day. One panel, it was full of pastors who shared how to lead through difficult times. And the other panel full of nonprofit pioneers who shared how to collaborate with people and organizations in our community to do more than we could do alone as a single entity. And in both panels, I kept hearing one thing repeated over and over. Real change in our communities has to be a collaborative effort. Whether it's working to support the unhoused population, feed the people around us, or build safer and more inclusive spaces in our community, we can maximize our ministry when we work together with other people who are trying to do that same work. I love an analogy that was shared by one of the panelists, Shep Crawford. He talked about the church as a gas station. He said that Sunday morning worship, like right now, is just the gas station, not the drive. He said, don't be discouraged if you see only a handful of people at the gas station, because that's just the beginning point. That's where we get fueled up. The community, that's the destination. We already know that God openly opposes anything that leads to injustice, especially cruel and unfair treatment of the most vulnerable people among us. And if our time together this morning is just a gas station, then the question then is, what is God sending us to do in our community? And what's our plan to build it up? Maybe you're already doing some important work in our community, and if so, that is awesome. Or if you're not sure where your role is, this is a good time to give some thought to your next destination in the community. I think as we're reading the story of Samson, I think it's easy, right, to point fingers at Israel in the time of Judges and wonder what was their deal And how do they keep getting stuck in this endless cycle? But I think if we look to our own context, our own life, our own work, I suspect that there are probably some areas of improvement that we could work on, right? You know, as isolating and as limiting as this pandemic has been at times for our communities, I think it's also given us a new perspective on what's important and what we'd like to see changed around us. You know, here's the problem that we run into in the story of Samson. He doesn't care about his people. He doesn't care about anybody. He only cares about himself. He certainly doesn't care about the Philistines, who are in the crosshairs of divine justice, and he could care less about the calling that God placed on him in the womb to deliver the people of Israel. And that is abundantly evident in the way that he treats his Nazirite vows, which is basically non-existent. Let's take a quick look at those vows and all the ways that Samson breaks them. He's supposed to avoid strong drink, have a life of sobriety. What does he do? He spends time in the vineyards that belong to a man named Timnah and parties with the young men there, which certainly would have involved drinking. He's supposed to be avoiding dead bodies according to the ancient purity laws. But what does he do? He eats honey out of a dead lion's carcass and shares it with his parents without telling them where it came from, by the way. So double whammy there. He also picks up a jawbone from a rotting donkey and uses it to kill a bunch of Philistines. Samson is supposed to leave his hair untouched. No razor shall touch his head. And yet, he basically puts out the welcome mat for his hair to be cut in his interactions with Delilah. And finally, Samson is supposed to stand out from the crowd as that judge for Israel. So to look different than the people that that have been oppressively ruling over Israel. So he's supposed to look different than the Philistines. And yet, what does he do? Nothing different. He gets drunk with them. He tricks them, he exploits them, he kills them, he becomes sexually intimate with them, and he even marries one of them. So Samson's like, vows? What vows? Or at least that's what we're thinking as we're following this story of Samson. Adele Reinhardt writes this about the disappointing turn of events. If, as H.R. Jouse maintains, the aesthetic value of a literary work is highest when it frustrates or disappoints the expectations of its readers. If that's true, then the story of Samson is an aesthetic masterpiece. In other words, the story of Samson makes for a gripping but tortuous read because it turns out that Samson is not who we thought he was. He was supposed to be a hero, but he is anything but that. Never saw it coming. That huge angelic announcement at the beginning gets our hopes up, but only one chapter later they are dashed to the ground. So beginning in chapter 14, Samson's calling as a judge unravels very quickly. You know, you remember that character Pigpen from Charlie Brown? The kid who has got this dust cloud swirling around him wherever he goes. Well, Samson seems to kick up a dust storm of trouble in every Philistine town that he visits. And even when it comes to his romantic relationships, Samson somehow finds a way to sabotage them. And paying attention to Samson's romantic affairs is actually the best way to make sense of the person that Samson is. After all, relationships do tend to bring out the best in us, but sometimes worse in us, right? And there are 3 women that Samson brings into his dust storm of trouble. First, there is a Philistine woman from Timnah who becomes the casualty of Samson's reckless, violent games and actually eventually dies along with her father because of Samson. Next, there is a Philistine sex worker from Gaza who almost gets entangled into Samson's drama. And then finally, there is a Philistine woman from Sorek named Delilah, who sees Samson for who he really is and hands him over to her people, Samson's enemies. All three relationships show us that Samson only cares about himself. To Samson, the women are disposable. In fact, he literally abandons his wife from Timnah just over hurt feelings. Judges 14, 19 through 20. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Over a little squabble that was probably insignificant in the long run, just leaves her in the dust, and she is given away to another man. In all of this, Samson shows us that not only has he rejected his God-given role of judge, wasting an incredible strength, fearless confidence, but he's become everything that God is trying to strip away from the people of Israel. Mark Twain once said, "To get the full value of joy, you must have someone to divide it with." Well, Samson never gets that experience of joy, the joy of sharing, of lifting up the other, of sharing in a common goal, because he is selfish to the core. And in the end, Samson is the last and the worst of the judges of Israel. Clinton McCannon writes this: the Spirit will come upon Samson more than any of the judges, but with the least effect. Let that just sit with you a moment. God can give you everything that you need to accomplish God's will, but he's not going to make you. And what is this? What is it that they say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink? And if we stopped here in the sermon, I suppose you might say that there's really not a lot that's redeemable in this Samson story. Maybe it's just a tragedy with way too much violence and machismo-ness. It might make for a good Shakespeare play or a Clint Eastwood movie, but what are we supposed to gain from it other than maybe a strong cautionary tale? Well, thankfully, at least as I see it and as I've read, there is a gospel message in this story. And I want to end with two sort of final nuggets to chew on as the service winds down and as we get ready to leave this gas station and head into the community. First, God's grace is so far beyond our understanding that even when we feel like our vision is clouded, even when we find ourselves stumbling through a dark period of our life, even then, God does not abandon us. There is always hope because of who God is. As McCann writes, Samson repeatedly forgets God, as did the Israelites, but God will not forget Samson. In this case, the hopeful note is not that God's purpose is fulfilled, because it's not. Rather, Israel's hope lies in the God who will be lovingly faithful to a ludicrously unfaithful people. In a word, it's a riddle of grace. And if you're ever feeling down on yourself, beating yourself up about maybe what you've become or who you wish you'd become or something you felt like didn't go well, know that God is our hope. Also, you probably can't screw it up worse than Samson, right? So you always have that. My second and last takeaway from this wild story of love, betrayal, and vengeance: it's easy to get pulled into the big action and miss the important things that are happening behind the scenes, especially in a theatrical story like Samson. Sometimes we need to ask God to guide our attention to the right things. A quick illustration: I had to take Julian to a routine doctor's appointment this week, and to pass the time while we were waiting, we watched a few minutes of this show that I found on Disney Plus called Wings of Life. It opens with a jungle scene, and Meryl Streep is narrating, and she says, "One might imagine that the most important life forms are large, flashy, or smart." And throughout this sequence, the camera moves from a sloth hanging in a tree to a bright, beautiful red parrot to a monkey sitting on a branch thinking about his next move. Then she goes on, "But it is love among the little things that actually runs the vast machinery of life. Some of the most important events on earth occur quietly in small and hidden worlds." And as she's saying this, we get a close-up of a butterfly, a bee, a few ants doing their quiet but incredibly important work, pollinating, doing all of those things. And so it's easy to let Samson dominate the story of Judges 13 through 16. After all, he's the main character. But we would be at a huge loss if we missed the little things. The little things that tell us that Samson is actually maybe not the hero of the story. Maybe, in fact, it's Samson's mother who shows us how to pay attention to what God is doing. That is maybe the best hashtag never saw it coming moment, because who would have thought that a character who never gets named in the story, who occupies a lot less screen time than her son, is actually the most heroic of any character in the story? Manoah seems to be preoccupied by anxious and restless thoughts as he responds to God's message to that couple. And Samson is just plain out, not listening at all. But Samson's mother, that unnamed woman, takes the appropriate response of awe and wonder and action. Judges 13:6. Then Samson's mother, came and told her husband, "A man of God came to me. His appearance like that of an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from. He did not tell me his name." It's Samson's mother who knows when to listen, when to act. She's the one who understands how to connect with the divine and what to do when God comes knocking on your door. As McCann writes this, "Will the reader of Judges 13 through 16 have the insight to detect that of all the characters in Judges 13 through 16, an unnamed woman bears the closest relationship to God, models a behavior that God wills for God's people throughout the book of Judges, attentiveness to God's word, and a distinctive lifestyle that sets one apart from other nations and their destructive ways." The role reversal performed by Judges 13, and indeed by the portrayal of women elsewhere in the book of Judges, anticipates the role reversals performed by Jesus and his announcement and embodiment of the reign of God, in which the last shall be first, and the greatest among us will be a servant. We're going to be closing this service with a hymn, "Here I Am, Lord." And as the band begins making their way up to the stage, and as we prepare to sing that hymn, let's remember that all that God asks of us is a willing spirit. Let's be like Samson's mother and just simply say yes. Who knows what will happen when we do? Amen.